Well, a tragic situation has been unfolding. 9 teenagers.
Like breaking news as we come on, this storm hitting just before things.
Massive flash floods created by heavy rains hit the Israeli desert.
Buildings, they just disappear. Look.
The ground is speaking, and it's using our cities as its voice. What began as scattered disasters across America has formed into something no probability model predicted: a signature. Each event carries a timestamp, a location, and a symbol that echoes warnings written thousands of years ago. Fire fell selectively in Hollywood, sparing a gardener's home while consuming a mansion 10 feet away. The wind didn't explain it. The fuel didn't explain it. Firefighters called it impossible, then stopped talking publicly. Water turned red in Miami as crowds celebrated midnight. Not everywhere, just the entertainment district, just the places where excess gathered thickest. And in the wilderness, where Lake Powell's waters withdrew, footprints appeared in stone. Massive impressions aligned in sequence, all pointing east toward a horizon nobody's watching. This isn't about belief, it's about observation. 7 elements: water, fire, earth, wind, insect, metal, sound, have activated across 17 states in 31 days. Each carrying biblical imagery too precise to dismiss, each happening at times that match prophetic calendars. Whether you call it judgment, warning, or cosmic coincidence, something is counting down, and the intervals are getting shorter. January didn't arrive like other Januaries. The calendar turned, but something else shifted underneath. Philadelphia felt it first. January 3rd, 2025, a Thursday afternoon, unremarkable until 2:47 p.m. when the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning for Center City. Tornadoes don't form in Philadelphia in January. The atmospheric conditions don't support it. Wind shear requires specific temperature gradients. Moisture needs to align with pressure systems. Every meteorological requirement was absent. The tornado formed anyway. EF4 intensity. It carved a path 3 blocks wide, moving with surgical precision through historic districts. Christ Church, built in 1695, stood directly in its path. The structure where George Washington once worshipped, where Benjamin Franklin's funeral was held. The tornado didn't destroy it completely, it opened it. The dome shattered, stone walls buckled, and inside, a massive fabric curtain hanging in the sanctuary split from ceiling to floor. One clean tear. Witnesses inside said the fabric didn't rip gradually. It separated all at once, like scissors through silk, at exactly 3 p.m. The same hour, 2,000 years ago, Matthew records another curtain tearing, the temple veil in Jerusalem, top to bottom, the moment Christ died. Historians noted the parallel. Engineers studied the wind patterns. The footage circulated for 48 hours before the next event made people stop calling it coincidence. Los Angeles, January 6th. The wildfires weren't unusual for Southern California. Drought conditions had persisted for 3 years. Vegetation was dry. Santa Ana winds were forecasted. Every ingredient for disaster was present and documented. What wasn't documented was the pattern of destruction. The Palisades fire moved uphill against the wind. Multiple fire crews reported the same observation independently. Flames advancing in directions that contradicted airflow. Spot fires igniting in sequences that made no tactical sense. Then came the selectivity. An estate in the Hollywood Hills worth $42 million burned to its foundation. Every structure, every tree, even the swimming pool cracked from heat. The property belonged to a tech billionaire known for publicly mocking religious faith. His social media history showed years of posts ridiculing prayer, scripture, belief itself. 15 feet away, across a property line marked by a chain-link fence, a small house remained untouched, not singed, not smoke damaged, untouched. The owner was a 73-year-old gardener who'd worked the same plot for 40 years. Neighbors described him as quiet, prayerful, the kind of man who still said grace before meals. Fire investigators couldn't explain it. Same fuel load, same wind exposure, same firefighting response. Two completely different outcomes separated by 15 feet of dirt. The footage went viral. Theological debates erupted. But before conclusions could form, Miami interrupted everything. January 1st, 2025, New Year's Eve stretched into New Year's Day. South Beach packed with celebrations, hotels at capacity, streets closed for parties that had been planned for months. Weather forecasts showed rain, but nothing severe. A tropical system pushing up from the Gulf, standard for the season.
The storm surge arrived at 12:17 a.m. 17 minutes after midnight. Water rose through storm drains, sidewalks, underground parking structures. Within 8 minutes, Ocean Drive was waist deep. Cars floated between buildings. People scrambled to second-floor balconies. But the color stopped the panic briefly. Confusion preceded fear. The water was red. Not brown from sediment, not orange from rust. Deep red, almost crimson, visible even under streetlights and neon. Later analysis showed a combination of algae bloom, mineral content, and ash from distant fires. Technically explainable, except it only turned red in the entertainment district. 2 miles north, the water ran clear. 2 miles south, clear. Just the strip where clubs, casinos, and parties concentrated, the water carried color. Exodus 7:20. The Nile turned to blood. First plague, first warning. Social media exploded. Video after video showed the same thing. Red water rising through celebration. Champagne glasses abandoned. Music still playing. People wading through liquid that looked like something the ocean shouldn't produce. 14 people drowned that night. Not from the depth, from the panic. From the crush of bodies trying to escape something that felt wrong in ways depth alone couldn't explain. 3 cities, 3 elements, 3 events in 6 days. Weather analysts compared notes. Seismologists checked data. The events were geographically distant, meteorologically unrelated. No shared pressure system, no connected fault activity. But the timing created a window. January 1st through January 6th. New Year's Day through Epiphany. The Christian calendar marks this as manifestation, when Christ was revealed to the world. The 12 days when heaven touched earth in recognizable form. And during that same window in 2025, 3 impossible events occurred at 3 symbolic locations. A church opened, a fire divided, water turned red during celebration. Pattern recognition is a human instinct. We find faces in clouds, meaning in randomness. Coincidence can cluster without conspiracy, but coincidence doesn't usually arrive with timestamps. It doesn't select targets with theological precision, and it doesn't accelerate. Because by January 10th, the count was at 7 events. By January 15th, 11, each carrying symbolism too specific to ignore, each happening at historically significant moments. The skeptics had explanations ready. Climate change, seismic cycles, statistical clustering, all valid, all scientifically sound. None of them addressed why a tornado formed in conditions that prohibit tornadoes, why fire moved against wind, why water changed color in a geographically limited zone. And none of them could explain what happened next in Denver. Water doesn't forget. It carries memory in its molecules, history in its currents. And in late December 2025, just before the new year, water began testifying across the American West. Lake Powell had been dying slowly for years. Drought, overuse, climate shifts, the explanations were documented and defensible. Water levels dropped predictably, shorelines retreated, boat ramps ended in dry sand. But what emerged as the water withdrew wasn't predicted at all. December 28th, a park ranger conducting routine surveys noticed geometric shapes in the exposed lake bed. Not natural erosion, straight lines, right angles, stone foundations arranged in patterns too deliberate for randomness. Archaeologists arrived within days. What they uncovered stopped them cold. An entire Puebloan settlement. Not ruins, structures. Adobe walls still standing, storage rooms intact, ceremonial kivas preserved as if the water had sealed them in time rather than eroding them. Carbon dating suggested the settlement was 800 years old, but the construction techniques didn't match the timeline. Metallurgy that shouldn't exist in pre-Columbian Southwest, aqueduct systems with engineering that rivaled Roman sophistication, and the orientation. Every structure, every wall, every doorway pointed east towards sunrise, towards something on the horizon. But the structures weren't what unsettled the team most. As the waterline continued dropping, they found the footprints. Massive depressions in limestone, arranged in walking sequence. Each impression measured 12 feet long, 5 feet wide, too large for any known animal, too precise for geological formation. The lead archaeologist released one statement before going silent. They're not petroglyphs, they're not carved, they're compressed into the stone, like something incredibly heavy walked here when the rock was soft. The footprints led east, all of them, a trail disappearing towards the horizon. Revelation 16:12 describes the Euphrates drying up to prepare the way for kings from the east. The passage has puzzled scholars for centuries. Why east? Why that river? Lake Powell isn't the Euphrates, but the pattern echoes. Water withdraws, a path appears, something moves to a destination. 2,000 miles away, water was doing the opposite, not withdrawing, arriving. Christmas night, 2025, Northern California. Two atmospheric river systems formed simultaneously off the coast. Standard winter storm pattern for the region. Forecasters tracked them, warnings were issued, preparations made. Then, the satellite imagery showed something meteorologists still can't explain. The two systems weren't moving independently. They were rotating around each other, like gears interlocking, maintaining perfect distance, perfect synchronization. One researcher whispered to colleagues, "It looks designed." The rainfall that followed wasn't normal precipitation. Laboratory analysis later showed water with higher molecular weight than standard H2O, denser, almost viscous. It didn't soak into the ground, it pooled. And where it pooled, things changed. Cars abandoned on Highway 101 didn't rust, they calcified. Metal, plastic, rubber, all of it hardening into a limestone-like substance within hours. Engines sealed shut, windows frosted over with mineral deposits. The vehicles looked ancient, petrified, like they'd been buried for centuries and just been excavated.
One tow truck operator described touching a car door and feeling it crumble like chalk. But the strangest reports came from the burn scars. California had endured massive wildfires the previous summer, millions of acres stripped to bare soil. Engineers predicted catastrophic mudslides when winter rains arrived. The mudslides didn't happen. Instead, the ground swelled. Soil expanded upward rather than washing downward. And from beneath the saturated earth, structures began emerging. Foundation stones, massive carved blocks arranged in geometric precision. Aqueducts made of solid gold running in straight lines beneath the landscape. Some stretching for miles before disappearing again into the earth. The gold wasn't decorative. Chemical analysis showed it was structural. Channels designed to carry something, aligned with fault lines and watershed boundaries. Archaeologists had no reference point. The structures predated known civilizations in North America. The engineering surpassed modern standards. And the gold, there were tons of it. Literally arranged in patterns that looked like circuit boards when photographed from above. One geologist said quietly, "This wasn't built on top of California. California was built on top of this." Water had revealed what had been hidden, not by accident, not through random erosion, through deliberate saturation, precise flooding, targeted exposure. In Scripture, water serves dual purpose. It cleanses and it reveals. Noah's flood removed corruption. The parting of the Red Sea exposed a path. Baptism washes away the old self to reveal the new. But water also holds accountable. It carries what we've buried. It returns what we've tried to forget. The Mississippi River proved that in ways nobody wanted to see. January 12, 2025, near the river's mouth where it meets the Gulf of Mexico, commercial fishermen reported unusual current behavior. Water that should spread into the Gulf was instead circling back, tightening, forming a rotation pattern visible from shore. By evening, a vortex had formed. Not a whirlpool, something larger, slower, more deliberate. The river was folding into itself, creating a depression in the surface that descended into darkness. Coast Guard vessels approached cautiously. 2 boats got within 100 yards before their engines cut out. Not mechanical failure, the engines ran, they just stopped producing thrust, as if the water itself had become too thick to push through. Then the river started giving things back. Bodies surfaced, not recent drownings, historical remains, clothing from the 1800s, shipwreckage from the Civil War era, even earlier, items that looked pre-colonial. Coroners examining the remains found preservation that shouldn't exist. Tissue that should have degraded centuries ago was intact, not mummified, preserved, as if the river had kept them in storage and decided the time had come to return them. One body pulled from the water wore a Union uniform. The identification tags were legible. The name matched military records from 1863. A soldier who'd gone missing during a Mississippi campaign. His family had been notified of his death 162 years ago. Now he was on a morgue table in Baton Rouge, looking like he'd drowned last week. The vortex lasted 3 days, then it stopped. The river resumed its normal flow. The water cleared. But it left questions that hydrology couldn't answer. Rivers don't store things. Current carries everything downstream eventually. Time breaks down organic material. The Mississippi shouldn't be able to preserve anything for centuries, then selectively return it. Unless water is more than chemistry. Unless it carries something beyond minerals and sediment. Unless it holds memory, witnesses silently, waits for the moment to testify. Genesis says the deep was there before creation began. Waters covered everything. God separated them, set boundaries, gave them limits. But water remembers what it covered, and when boundaries shift, what's been held down rises to the surface. The question isn't what the water revealed. The question is, what else is it still holding?
Fire doesn't negotiate. It consumes or it doesn't. There's no middle ground, no partial burning. The physics are simple. Heat, fuel, oxygen. When those elements combine, combustion is inevitable and indifferent. That's what made the Hollywood fires so disturbing. They weren't indifferent. January 6th, the Palisades ignition spread according to models for the first 4 hours. Firefighters tracked it. Containment lines were drawn. Evacuation zones mapped. Everything followed protocol. Then the fire started making choices. Ridge Road marked the boundary between 2 neighborhoods. North side, estates, gated properties, homes valued in the tens of millions. South side, working-class housing, ranch-style homes from the 1960s, properties maintained but modest. The fire came up the southern slope, standard behavior for the wind conditions. Crews expected it to crest the ridge and roll down into the expensive properties on the north side. It didn't crest, it turned, moved laterally along the ridge, then descended north, against the wind, against thermal dynamics, against every predictive model. 47 homes burned on the north side of Ridge Road. Total destruction. Foundations cracked from heat. Swimming pools boiled dry. Stone walls collapsed. On the south side, 0 homes burned. Not damaged, not threatened. 0. The fire line looked drawn with a ruler.
property boundaries became fire breaks without human intervention. One firefighter with 18 years experience said, "I've never seen fuel selectivity like this. Same vegetation on both sides, same moisture content, same wind. The fire just stopped, like it hit a wall we couldn't see." But the most documented case came from Sunset Plaza Drive. Two properties, side by side, separated by a chain link fence. Property A, 6.2 acres, main house, guest house, pool house, tennis courts. Owned by Marcus Feldstein, tech entrepreneur, net worth estimated at $400 million. Known publicly for atheist advocacy, funded billboards in 12 states reading, "Science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings." Property B, 0.8 acres, single-story ranch, owned by Jorge Mendoza, retired landscaper, spent 40 years maintaining gardens for the estates around him. Neighbors described him as quiet, attended St. Augustine's Catholic Church weekly, said rosary every evening on his porch. The fire reached both properties simultaneously. Video footage from multiple angles confirmed the timeline. Property A ignited in 7 locations at once, not from embers, from spontaneous combustion. Materials that shouldn't ignite at those temperatures burst into flame. The main house was fully involved within 12 minutes. Property B never caught fire, not a shingle, not a tree. The fence between the properties charred on Feldstein's side. Mendoza's side showed no heat damage. Arson investigators found no accelerants, no human intervention. The fire behaved according to physics on one side of the fence and violated physics on the other. Feldstein survived. He was in New York during the fire. His estate was insured for $60 million. He posted on social media, "Nature doesn't pick sides. This was bad luck and climate change, not divine judgment." Mendoza also survived. He'd been at evening mass when evacuation orders came. He returned to find his home untouched, surrounded by ash, still standing while mansions burned on 3 sides. He said nothing publicly, but his priest shared one comment. Jorge said it felt less like he was being spared and more like he was being shown something. Luke 12:49, Jesus said, "I came to cast fire on the earth. How I wish it were already kindled." The passage continues, verse 51, "Do you think I came to bring peace? No, I tell you, but division. Fire divides. It reveals what burns and what doesn't, what withstands heat and what collapses. But natural fire doesn't select based on belief. It burns the faithful and faithless equally. Physics doesn't read social media posts. Chemistry doesn't care about church attendance."
So when fire begins showing selectivity, the explanation's narrow. Either the variables we're measuring are incomplete, or forces we're not measuring are present. Dallas provided another data point. January 9th, the thunderstorm formed rapidly. Meteorologists tracked it but didn't classify it as severe. Standard winter system. Rain expected, lightning possible, nothing warranting warnings. Then the lightning frequency spiked. Normal storms produce 1 to 2 strikes per minute. This system produced 17 per second. Power grids failed across downtown. Transformers exploded. Fires ignited at 43 locations simultaneously. Emergency services were overwhelmed instantly. The rain that followed fell in a concentrated area. Radar showed precipitation over a zone roughly 2 miles in diameter. Downtown core, financial district, entertainment venues. The rain was red. Not brown, not orange, red. Laboratory analysis later identified the color source: particulate matter, dust from West Texas, ash from the California fires, industrial pollutants, iron oxide, all technically present in the atmosphere, all capable of producing discoloration. But the concentration made no meteorological sense.
Particles don't cluster that densely in a single precipitation event, and they don't fall in geographically limited zones while surrounding areas receive clear rain. The red rain fell for 90 seconds, then stopped. Normal precipitation resumed immediately after. Street footage showed people standing in the colored water, looking at their hands, their clothes, the pavement. Some knelt, some ran, some stood frozen. One woman was recorded saying repeatedly, "It's the plague, it's the plague." She was referring to Exodus, the first sign. Water turned to blood. Her video got 40 million views before the platform removed it for misinformation. But misinformation requires false information. The rain was red. The footage was authentic. The biblical parallel was observable. Whether the parallel meant anything beyond coincidence, that was interpretation. That was where data ended and belief began. Except the patterns kept tightening. Fire showing selectivity, water showing memory, and in Yellowstone, earth and air began collaborating in ways that looked less like nature and more like announcement. The ground has always moved. Plates shift, magma rises, pressure releases. Earthquakes are geology in motion, predictable in pattern if not in timing. They crack foundations, topple structures, reshape landscapes. But they don't usually open graves at specific times. New Orleans, January 7th, 2:47 p.m. Central Time. The earthquake registered 4.2 magnitude. Shallow depth, unusual for the region but not unprecedented. The New Madrid seismic zone occasionally sends tremors southeast. Structures shook, windows cracked, nothing catastrophic. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 sits just outside the French Quarter. Above-ground tombs, necessary because New Orleans rests below sea level. The dead can't be buried in earth that floods, so they're sealed in stone vaults, stacked in rows, a city of the dead mirroring the city of the living. When the tremor hit, dozens of tomb seals loosened. Stone lids shifted, not violently, just enough. And then the ground moved again. Smaller aftershock, 2.1 magnitude, barely noticeable, except it occurred at exactly 3 p.m. The hour Christ died, the hour the Philadelphia curtain tore, the hour that appears repeatedly in these events. Witnesses near the cemetery, tourists mostly, reported seeing figures in the gaps between tombs. Not clearly, not for long. Shapes in the dust and mist that rose when stone shifted. Human forms, standing still, outlined against white marble.
Video footage captured shadows. Nothing definitive, nothing that couldn't be dismissed as light and particles and fear shaping perception. But multiple witnesses, separately interviewed, described the same detail. The figures didn't move toward them. They faced outward, toward the city, toward the French Quarter, toward the places where celebration had turned into commerce, where jazz had become background noise for drunkenness, where history was costumed for profit. Matthew 27:52 through 53 records a similar event. When Jesus died, tombs opened. Bodies of saints rose. After his resurrection, they appeared in Jerusalem. The passage has troubled theologians for 2,000 years. It doesn't explain where they went after appearing. It doesn't clarify their purpose. It just states fact. The dead became visible, briefly, at the moment heaven and earth intersected. New Orleans officials inspected the cemetery. They found structural damage consistent with seismic activity. They resealed the tombs. They issued statements about earthquake preparedness. They didn't address the 74 people who reported seeing figures that afternoon. They didn't explain why the aftershock occurred at 3 p.m. exactly. Some things get documented, some things get dismissed, and some things get quietly filed away because addressing them opens questions nobody's prepared to answer. But the earth wasn't finished speaking. Philadelphia, the tornado on January 3rd had opened Christ Church. The curtain tore, but damage assessment revealed something deeper. The church foundation, laid in 1695, showed cracking that extended below the basement. Structural engineers brought in ground-penetrating radar to assess stability. What they found wasn't instability, it was a chamber. 12 feet below the basement floor, a sealed room, stone construction, no modern records of its existence, no mention in church archives. They opened it on January 14th. Inside, documents, preserved in metal boxes, letters, journals, records from the 1700s, some in English, some in Latin, some in languages the initial team couldn't identify. One journal, dated 1723, written by a reverend whose name appeared in church records. The entries began normally, sermons, marriages, baptisms. Then the tone shifted. December entries described visions, warnings. The reverend wrote about dreams where the church opened, the curtain tore, and a voice said, "When this happens, count the days carefully. The revealing has begun." The journal ended abruptly. No final entry, just blank pages. The reverend died in 1724. Cause of death? Unknown. He was 38 years old. The documents were transferred to archivists. The chamber was resealed. The church issued no public statement, but someone leaked photos of the journal pages. Social media exploded. Debates raged about authenticity, interpretation, meaning. The church eventually released one sentence: "We acknowledge historical documents were discovered. Analysis is ongoing." 300 years, buried, sealed, waiting beneath a building that would one day have its curtain torn by a tornado that shouldn't exist. Pattern or coincidence? Either the universe is deeply ironic or deeply intentional. Denver provided the next testimony. January 11th. The blizzard had been forecast for days. Arctic air plunging south, moisture from the Pacific colliding with it. Models predicted heavy snow they underestimated by half. 63 inches fell in 28 hours. Denver International Airport closed completely. Interstate 25 became a parking lot of abandoned vehicles. The city stopped, and in the stillness, people looked up. The cloud formation hung over the Front Range for hours. Normally, storm systems move. This one settled, anchored. As the sun began setting, the clouds caught light, deep reds, ambers, golds. Standard refraction through ice crystals, but the shape wasn't standard. From multiple vantage points, Highlands, Capitol Hill, Aurora, people photographed the same thing. The cloud formation looked like a lamb, not vaguely, specifically. 4 legs, body, head turned slightly, as if looking back toward the city. Meteorologists explained lenticular cloud formations, atmospheric conditions, pareidolia, human tendency to see patterns. Except, lenticular clouds form over mountains from specific wind patterns. They don't maintain shape for 3 hours, and they don't appear during blizzards when wind shear should prevent formation entirely. The shape held until full dark. Then the clouds released their final wave of snow and dispersed. Revelation 5:6. John sees a lamb standing as though slain, with 7 horns and 7 eyes. The image is judgment and authority combined. Not gentle, not weak, the Lamb who opens seals and unleashes consequences. Later, Revelation 19:11, heaven opens, a rider on a white horse appears, faithful and true, coming to judge. The Denver clouds showed a lamb during a storm that buried the city, buried movement, buried business, buried distraction. Under enforced stillness, people looked up, and for 3 hours they saw something that meteorology couldn't fully dismiss, and theology couldn't fully claim. Earth had spoken through stone in New Orleans, through foundation chambers in Philadelphia, through frozen sky in Denver. The ground, the buried, the atmosphere, all testifying, not with words, with events,
with impossible timing, with imagery too specific to ignore. Skeptics demanded scientific rigor. Believers claimed vindication. And between those camps, a growing group simply watched, measured, documented, and waited. Because if the Earth itself has become a witness, the question isn't whether to believe it. The question is what comes next when all the witnesses have spoken. The sky has always carried meaning. Sailors read it for storms. Farmers read it for seasons. Ancient civilizations mapped their calendars by its movements. But in January 2025, the sky stopped being passive. It started participating. Yellowstone, January 8th. Seismic activity had been elevated for weeks. Nothing alarming by Yellowstone standards. The caldera breathes, shifts, releases pressure constantly. Geologists monitored it. Tourists photographed it. Then, Old Faithful broke pattern. The geyser erupts predictably every 90 minutes, give or take 10 minutes. It's been measured, timed, analyzed for over a century. The reliability is what made it famous. On January 8th, it erupted 17 minutes early, then again 12 minutes later, then continuously for 42 minutes. The column reached heights never recorded, 350 feet. Normally, it tops out around 180 feet, and as it climbed, witnesses reported seeing the plume taking shapes, not random, deliberate. One photographer, present specifically to document the unusual activity, captured a sequence of images showing the plume taking a form that looked unmistakably like a figure holding something to its mouth. A trumpet, Revelation 8:6. 7 angels with 7 trumpets prepare to blow. Each trumpet releases a specific judgment. Hail and fire, mountains thrown into sea, waters turned bitter, a third of the sun darkened. The images went viral immediately. Debunkers said pareidolia, pattern recognition and randomness, the mind seeing what it wants to see. Except 3 separate photographers positioned at different angles captured similar shapes, and audio equipment near the geyser recorded something unusual, a low-frequency tone beneath the expected rushing water sound, harmonic, sustained, almost musical. One seismologist described it carefully. There was a resonance we don't typically associate with hydrothermal eruptions. The spectral analysis showed organization. I can't explain the source.
The eruption stopped as abruptly as it began. Old Faithful returned to normal intervals. The audio anomaly didn't repeat, but something had announced itself through steam and stone, through frequency and form. Whether message or warning, the sky had briefly spoken in visual language. It wasn't finished. The phenomenon lasted 4 minutes. Then, normal sunset colors returned. Video footage confirmed it. The sun appeared as a dark circle against a lighter sky, reversed from every natural sunset. Atmospheric scientists proposed dust, pollution, rare particulate configurations. But Phoenix has had dust storms for millennia. This was documented as unique. Revelation 6:12, when the 6th seal opens, the sun became black as sackcloth. One event, one city, one witness. Coincidence? Multiple events, multiple cities. Consistent symbolism, pattern. But the most disturbing sky event came from the Midwest, Illinois, January 16th, evening. Clear conditions, stars visible. Then, the northern horizon began glowing. Not aurora borealis, wrong latitude, wrong color. This was amber, pulsing. Within 20 minutes, the glow spread across half the sky. Witnesses described it as alive, moving in waves, breathing. Emergency management received hundreds of calls. People thought it was fire, industrial explosion, nuclear event. It was none of those things. Atmospheric scientists eventually identified it as an extreme case of light pillar phenomenon. Ice crystals in the atmosphere, reflecting ground lights upward. Rare but natural, except the lights were amber.
and there are no ground sources in rural Illinois that produce amber light at that intensity. And the pulsing, light pillars don't pulse, they're static reflections. One astronomer monitoring the event said, "If I didn't know better, I'd say something was moving behind the atmosphere, like watching a shadow pass behind a curtain." The glow lasted 37 minutes. Then it collapsed inward toward a central point and vanished. No scientific consensus emerged. Papers were written. Data was analyzed. The term anomaly appeared frequently. Translation: we saw it, we measured it, we don't understand it. Luke 21:25. Jesus warns, there will be signs in sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. Signs, plural. Not one cosmic event, but multiple atmospheric testimonies. Things in the sky that cause perplexity, the inability to explain despite observation. The sky had become a witness. Clouds shaped like symbols, light behaving impossibly, pressure manifesting without meteorological cause. And beneath that active sky, cities were beginning to crack. Cities are concentrations of people, of power, of desire, of excess. They amplify everything: creativity and corruption, innovation and decay. When judgment comes, Scripture suggests it comes to cities first. Not because cities are more sinful than rural areas, but because cities make sin visible, organized, celebrated. Las Vegas learned this on January 10th. The city runs on electricity. Light is its product, its currency, its theology. Neon salvation, digital transcendence, the promise that enough brightness can erase any darkness. At 11:47 p.m., every major LED system along the strip began emitting a frequency, not audible to most people, subsonic, below 20 hertz. But insects heard it. Within 8 minutes, the sky turned black, not from clouds, from flies. Billions of them, swarming from the desert in formations so dense they appeared solid. Streetlights vanished behind layers of insects. Casino facades disappeared. The famous "Welcome to Las Vegas" sign became invisible. The sound wasn't buzzing. Witnesses described it as rhythmic, pulsing, almost like breathing. The collective movement of wings created a pressure wave that rattled windows and set off car alarms. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Hospitals filled with people who'd inhaled insects, whose eyes and throats were clogged with bodies. Cooling systems failed as vents became blocked. Slot machines overheated. Power grids struggled under the load of systems fighting to stay cool. The swarm lasted 4 hours. Then, at 3:47 a.m., it lifted all at once. The flies rose vertically, formed a column over the city, and dispersed into the desert darkness. Morning revealed a city coated in black. Streets, buildings, vehicles, everything layered with dead insects.
The cleanup took 3 weeks. The financial impact exceeded $200 million. Entomologists couldn't identify the trigger. No breeding event explained the numbers. No environmental factor explained the synchronization. Exodus 8:24. Fourth plague. Swarms of flies covering Egypt, the land ruined by them. Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies. In demonology, the name represents decay disguised as abundance, rot beneath glamour, death feeding on excess. Las Vegas sells the illusion that consequences don't apply, that luck replaces law, that pleasure has no price. For 4 hours, the city learned otherwise. But Vegas wasn't alone in receiving visitors. Washington, D.C., January 12th, early morning. Capitol Police noticed birds gathering on the dome. Not unusual, birds roost on government buildings constantly, but the number increased rapidly. Within an hour, thousands of ravens covered every available surface. Then they began dropping things. Coins, heavy, gold, hundreds of them clattering onto marble steps, concrete walkways, the plaza surrounding the Capitol. Tourists picked them up. Security collected them. Each coin was identical, ancient gold. One side showed a skull, the other side was blank.
Within 30 minutes, fights broke out. People pushing, shoving, scrambling for coins. 3 people were hospitalized, 1 arrest for assault. The ravens watched, silent, not cawing, not moving, just watching. Then they lifted, all at once. The sky filled with black wings, circling the dome 3 times before dispersing north. The coins were analyzed. Gold content, 99.7% pure. Age, undeterminable. Metallurgy, consistent with ancient Middle Eastern techniques, but the skull imagery didn't match any known civilization. Judas received 30 pieces of silver for betrayal, blood money, coins that bought corruption. The ravens brought gold to the seat of American power, and Americans trampled each other to claim it. Matthew 6:24. You cannot serve both God and money. The test wasn't subtle. Coins fell from the sky, and the response was violence. But the most haunting urban event came from Hollywood. January 15th, evening. The billboards along Hollywood Boulevard began malfunctioning. Standard digital displays, movie ads, product placements, celebrity faces, but instead of advertisements, they started showing memories, personal memories, specific to whoever was looking at them. A woman waiting for a bus saw her wedding day on the screen above her. Not a generic wedding, her dress, her husband who died 2 years earlier, his smile, his eyes. She stopped walking, stood frozen, watching herself dance with a man who no longer existed anywhere but in that screen. Across the boulevard, a man saw himself at 17, running on a beach with friends who died in a car accident 20 years ago. The footage was from an angle he'd never seen, as if someone had filmed them that day, but no one had cameras. This was 1985. The screens showed private moments, intimate memories, things no database contained, no social media preserved, no cloud storage held. Births, funerals, first kisses, last goodbyes. The screens displayed the past with perfect clarity, perfect detail, perfect emotional precision. People stopped, thousands of them, standing in intersections, on sidewalks, in the middle of traffic, eyes locked on screens showing their lives reflected back. The phenomenon lasted 6 hours. During that time, 47 people collapsed from dehydration. 19 were hospitalized. They couldn't look away, couldn't stop watching, couldn't release the past long enough to drink water or seek shade. When the screens finally returned to normal programming, the weeping started, audible across the boulevard. People crying not from sadness, but from loss, the loss of something they'd just been given and couldn't keep. Genesis 19. Lot's wife looked back toward Sodom. She turned to salt, not because looking was evil, but because longing for what's past prevents movement forward. Hollywood sells nostalgia, recreates the past, offers people the chance to live in memories instead of reality. For 6 hours, the offer was perfect, complete, undeniable, and it nearly killed people. One survivor, a teacher from Pasadena, described it. I saw my mother. She died when I was 12. I saw her making breakfast. I heard her laugh. It felt more real than this moment right now. I would have stayed there forever. I didn't want to be here without her. She was found unconscious, severe dehydration. Another hour and she would have died. Died staring at a screen. Died choosing memory over life. But the cities weren't finished.
Salt Lake City, January 18th. The Great Salt Lake had been receding for years, a slow death. Water diverted, drought intensifying, ecosystem collapsing. But as the waterline pulled back, something emerged from the exposed lakebed. Structures, white, brilliant, made entirely of salt. Not formations, buildings, walls, streets, an entire city crystallized in the mineral crust. Archaeologists investigated, but anyone who entered the Salt City reported the same experience. They saw themselves, not reflections, perfected versions, younger, healthier, free of scars, wrinkles, weakness. The figures didn't speak. They just stood there, waiting, and one by one, visitors stopped leaving. Search and rescue found them standing among the salt structures, motionless,
Unresponsive, over the course of 48 hours they hardened, crystallized, became part of the city. 17 people, frozen mid-step, faces peaceful, eyes open. Medical examination showed they were still alive, heartbeat, brain activity, but unreachable, locked inside bodies that had become mineral. The area was evacuated and sealed, access denied. But before the closure, one rescue worker reported seeing thousands of figures in the deeper structures, all standing, all waiting, all crystallized. Lot's wife looked back and became salt, a warning about attachment, about the danger of longing for what was instead of moving toward what's coming. The Salt City offered people themselves, perfected, preserved, frozen at their best moment, and they accepted, traded motion for stillness, life for monument. 4 cities, 4 temptations, wealth, power, memory, perfection, 4 tests, 4 failures. The pattern was tightening, and the intervals between events were shrinking. The past doesn't stay buried. Soil shifts, water recedes, time erodes the layers we use to separate now from then. And sometimes the past doesn't wait for erosion. Sometimes it erupts. Lake Powell's retreating waters had revealed Puebloan structures and massive footprints pointing east. But the discovery that stopped archaeological teams came later, deeper, beneath the stone. January 17th. Ground-penetrating radar scanning the exposed lakebed detected a massive void, rectangular, too precise for natural formation. They excavated carefully. Beneath 12 feet of compacted sediment, they found a chamber, sealed with stone blocks weighing several tons each. No mortar. The blocks fit together with tolerances measured in millimeters. Inside, tablets, stone, covered in script. Not Puebloan, not any Native American writing system on record. The characters resembled cuneiform, but the structure was different, hybrid, as if someone had taken multiple ancient languages and synthesized them into something new. Translation teams are still working, but preliminary analysis of the tablets suggests they're astronomical, tracking celestial cycles, predicting alignments. The dates on the tablets, once decoded, showed intervals: 7 years, 70 years, 700 years. One sequence ended with a date, 2025. The chamber also contained something else, a map, carved into the floor, showing the North American continent. But the geography was wrong. Coastlines didn't match modern borders. The Mississippi ran differently. Mountain ranges appeared in places that are now flatland. One geologist compared the map to tectonic reconstructions. The geography matched North America from 8,000 years ago, before the last ice age ended, before sea levels rose. Someone had carved a map of ancient America, sealed it in a chamber, and waited. The tablets were removed, the chamber resealed. Official statements called it a significant archaeological find requiring further study. No mention of the date, no mention of the map showing a continent that shouldn't exist in human memory. But the discovery fit a pattern emerging across the country. California's golden aqueducts, exposed by flooding, were analyzed. The engineering was impossible for pre-Columbian civilization. The metallurgy required technology that didn't exist in the Americas before European contact.
Yet carbon dating of organic material trapped in the gold suggested an age between 4,000 and 6,000 years. The alignments were precise. The aqueducts followed fault lines exactly. They intersected at points where seismic activity concentrates, as if designed not to survive earthquakes, but to interact with them. Beneath one shifted vault, workers found a passage, descending, not modern construction. Stone that showed weathering inconsistent with New Orleans' 300-year history. The passage led to a chamber. Unlike Lake Powell, this one wasn't empty. Bones, hundreds of them, arranged in patterns, concentric circles, spirals, geometric precision.
and in the center, a pillar, stone, covered in symbols that matched nothing in the archaeological record. Not Egyptian, not Mesopotamian, not Mayan. But they resembled the script found at Lake Powell. The chamber was sealed immediately. No official report released. Local news carried brief mentions, then stopped covering it. One archaeologist, speaking anonymously, said, "There's a consistent instruction from federal coordinators. Document, catalog, don't interpret publicly. These sites are showing connections nobody wants to discuss." Because the connections were impossible. Writing systems that appear in locations thousands of miles apart. Technology that predates known civilization. Maps showing geography from before recorded history. Chambers sealed and waiting, as if someone knew they'd be opened at specific times. Ecclesiastes 1:9. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. The verse suggests cycles, history repeating, civilizations rising and falling in patterns. But what if the cycle isn't metaphor? What if civilizations have risen before, achieved knowledge, built monuments, then vanished so completely that only fragments remain buried beneath the world we think is permanent? And what if those civilizations left warnings, sealed messages, time capsules meant to open when the cycle approached its conclusion again? Denver provided another piece. During blizzard cleanup, construction crews repairing foundation damage on Colfax Avenue broke through into a space that shouldn't exist. Below the street, beneath sewers and utility lines, they found a room, brick, old brick, construction style dating to the 1860s. But Denver was barely a settlement in the 1860s. There was no infrastructure requiring rooms 20 feet underground. Inside the room, documents, sealed in lead boxes, letters, journals, written in English, dated 1871. The letters described visions, a group calling themselves the Watchers, not a religious order, engineers, scientists, people observing patterns in disasters, tracking cycles. One letter, signed by a man named Elias Thorne, read, "We have seen the pattern repeat in records from London, Rome, Baghdad, Cairo. Every 350 years, the signs converge. Fire shows selectivity. Water reveals what was hidden. Earth opens and testifies. The sky displays warnings. Cities respond with madness. And the past surfaces to remind the living that this has happened before. We cannot stop what comes. We can only document it. So the next generation, should they find this, will know. You are not the first to witness this. You will not be the last. But you are living in the interval where the choice matters most. Prepare not by fleeing, but by standing firm. The pattern completes itself, whether humanity acknowledges it or not." The letter was dated March 15, 1871, 354 years before 2025. The documents were transferred to the Denver Public Library archives, available upon request. No media coverage, no public announcement. One librarian asked about them, said, "People can read them if they want. Most don't want to, because the implications are destabilizing. Either multiple civilizations across millennia have all hallucinated the same patterns, or the patterns are real. If they're real, history isn't linear. Progress isn't guaranteed, and the assumption that we're smarter, safer, more advanced than those who came before, that assumption collapses. The past was surfacing, not to educate, to warn. In Scripture, remembrance is commanded. Passover, communion, monuments of stone. Remember what the Lord has done, because humans forget quickly, completely. One generation experiences deliverance, the next takes it for granted, the third denies it ever happened. The buried warnings were resurfacing at the same time modern disasters were intensifying, as if the cycle had built-in redundancy, as if those who came before knew their warnings would be ignored until the present provided its own undeniable testimony. And testimony was accelerating. Time was compressing. Events that should have been separated by months were occurring within days. Gaps were closing, the intervals between signs shrinking. January 19th marked a threshold. 3 separate events, 3 different states, all occurring within a 6-hour window. It started in Oregon, Mount Hood, 3:14 a.m. Pacific. Seismic sensors detected movement, not earthquake, something rising. Magma displacement without eruption, the mountain swelling.
By 6 a.m., the summit had risen 14 feet, visible to satellite imaging, measurable to ground surveys. But no lava, no ash, no thermal signature suggesting imminent eruption. The mountain was just expanding, like a slow breath inward. Geologists scrambled. Evacuation zones were discussed. But evacuate based on what? The mountain wasn't erupting, it was changing shape. Then the sound started. Residents within 30 miles reported a low hum, constant, below hearing but felt in the chest. Windows vibrated, dishes rattled in cupboards. Audio equipment recorded it, 18 hertz, just below human hearing threshold, but sustained, unvarying. For 3 hours the mountain hummed. Then it stopped. The swelling halted. Seismic activity returned to background levels. But Mount Hood was now 14 feet taller than it had been at midnight. Revelation 6:14. Every mountain and island was removed from its place. Not destroyed, removed, relocated, changed. While Oregon dealt with a growing mountain, Texas was drowning. Houston, 6:47 a.m. Central, rush hour. Rain began. Forecasts had predicted showers, light precipitation, nothing severe. Within 20 minutes, rainfall rates exceeded anything in recorded history for the region. 6 inches in the first hour, then 8 inches in the second hour. Buffalo Bayou overflowed. Interstate 10 flooded. Downtown became a canal system. But the rain wasn't falling evenly. Radar showed a stationary cell directly over the city center, not moving, not rotating, just hovering and dumping water. Meteorologists had no explanation. Cells move, always. Atmospheric dynamics prevent stationary precipitation at that intensity. This one violated the rules. It sat over Houston's business district and released water like a faucet opened fully. By 10 a.m., water was chest deep in downtown streets. Cars floated. Buildings lost power. Emergency services couldn't respond. Boats couldn't navigate the current. Then, at 11:03 a.m., the rain stopped instantly. Not tapering, not decreasing. Full downpour to clear sky in seconds. The cell dissipated. The sun emerged. Water damage exceeded $3 billion. 17 deaths, hundreds injured. One emergency coordinator said, "I've managed hurricane response. This wasn't a hurricane. Hurricanes have structure. This was targeted." And while Houston bailed water, Arizona was burning. Phoenix, 9:22 a.m. Mountain, mid-morning. Wildfires aren't unusual for Arizona, but wildfires don't typically start in urban centers. 43 separate ignition points, all within Phoenix city limits, all occurring within a 7-minute window. No lightning, no electrical failures, no human cause identified. The fires just began simultaneously in patterns that formed a geometric shape when mapped, a 7-pointed star. Firefighters reported the same thing across all 43 sites. The fire reached a certain point and wouldn't advance, like it hit an invisible barrier. The star remained visible for 6 hours before crews could fully extinguish it. Revelation. New Orleans understood music the way other cities understood traffic or weather. It was infrastructure. It was breath. So when the instruments began playing themselves on February 14, 2026, the first response wasn't fear, it was listening. A trumpet in Preservation Hall released a note at dawn, clean, sustained,
perfect pitch. No hands touched it. The brass simply vibrated, and sound poured out like water finding its level. Across the street, a piano answered. Not random keys, a melody, deliberate, patient. Within minutes, every club along Frenchman Street was alive with music no one was making. Saxophones, drums, upright basses, guitars still in their cases, strings humming through leather and wood. The sound was unlike anything recorded in the city's 300-year history. It carried joy, but not celebration, longing, but not sadness. It felt ancient and newborn simultaneously, as though the air itself had finally remembered a song it had been holding since before the first foundation was poured. People stopped on sidewalks, cars idled at green lights. The streetcar on St. Charles Avenue halted mid-route, drivers standing in the aisle, tears streaming, unable to explain why. The music wasn't loud. That's what unsettled people most. It didn't force itself, it invited, and the invitation was almost impossible to refuse. Within an hour, the phenomenon spread beyond the French Quarter. In Gentilly, a grandmother's violin began playing itself on a mantel where it had sat silent for 40 years. In the lower Ninth Ward, a rusted trombone pulled from Katrina's wreckage produced notes so clear they shattered the window it sat behind. The melody was consistent across every instrument, same progression, same tempo, as though every piece of metal, wood, and string in the city had become part of a single organism, a single voice calling from somewhere beyond the visible world.
Audio engineers at Tulane tried to record it. Equipment failed. Not dramatically, no sparks, no smoke. The devices simply stopped registering input, as though the sound existed in a frequency their technology couldn't translate. One engineer described it carefully. The music wasn't entering the microphone, it was bypassing it, going straight into whoever was listening. Parents left children with neighbors without explanation. The neighbors didn't ask. Some of them were already walking, too. By early afternoon, an estimated 40,000 people stood along the Mississippi's edge, silent, facing east, while instruments throughout the city continued their impossible concert. The music had structure. Mathematicians later analyzing witness testimony identified patterns, Fibonacci sequences in the rhythm, golden ratios in the intervals between phrases. The melody contained information, language embedded so deeply that the conscious mind couldn't extract it, but something older could. One musicologist from Loyola said it plainly. This wasn't performance, it was a call, and half the city answered before they even realized they'd heard it. Then the river responded. At precisely 3 p.m., that hour again, always that hour, the current changed direction, not reversed, changed. The water began flowing upward and downward simultaneously, creating a vertical column in the center of the channel, rising 50 feet into the air, perfectly still despite the chaos around it. Inside the column, shapes moved, not random debris, forms with weight, with presence. Some witnesses reported seeing figures, human in outline but wrong in proportion, too tall, too bright, too solid to be mist or reflection. Others saw only light, cascading downward through the water like stairs, like an invitation to descend or ascend, the direction unclear. The music intensified, not louder, deeper. It began resonating in bone, in chest cavities, in the spaces between heartbeats. And people started walking into the river. Not frantically, not as though drowning. They walked as though the water were a door, and something on the other side had called them by name. Coast Guard vessels attempted rescue. They couldn't reach them. Every boat that approached the column was pushed back by a current that shouldn't exist, a pressure that operated independent of wind or tide. Helicopters overhead captured footage that news stations refused to air. The figures in the water weren't struggling. They were standing, submerged but upright, faces lifted toward the surface, arms at their sides, as though waiting for instruction.
One pilot reported what he saw before his radio cut out. They're not drowning, they're being held, and they look like they're listening to something we can't hear. Families on the riverbank screamed names. Some begged their loved ones to return. Others simply watched, frozen between intervention and understanding, caught in a moment too large for decision. The music played on, and the column of water stood unmoving, a vertical river connecting earth to sky, holding hundreds of people in suspension between two worlds. Emergency services were overwhelmed within minutes. Hospitals mobilized dive teams that never entered the water, not because of resistance, but because of what they felt standing at the edge. Every first responder interviewed afterward described the same sensation, that stepping into the river wasn't rescue, it was choice, and the choice wasn't theirs to make. By evening, the music began to fade, not stopping, receding, as though moving away, traveling to some other city, some other river, some other population that hadn't yet been given the chance to listen.
The music intensified throughout the afternoon. Not just instruments now, voices joined, human voices, singing without words, harmonizing in a structure so complex that musicologists would later compare it to compositions requiring hundreds of performers. Yet it emerged from empty rooms, from car radios, from dental office speakers playing what should have been soft jazz. By 2:30 p.m., the phenomenon had become impossible to ignore, even for those who dismissed the previous events. The song was coming from everywhere, from air itself, from the spaces between buildings, from inside people's chests, vibrating in their ribs, making breath itself part of the choir. And then, at exactly 3 p.m., across all time zones simultaneously, an impossibility that broke physics but occurred anyway, the rivers answered. 17 rivers, 17 cities, all reversing flow in the same instant. The Mississippi ran north, the Colorado climbed upward toward its source, the Potomac flowed away from the sea. But this wasn't chaos. The reversed currents were stronger than the original flow, more purposeful, as though the water had been waiting for permission to return to something it had left long ago. Where the currents met obstacles, dams, locks, bridge supports, the water didn't stop, it rose. Vertical rivers climbing into the air, defying gravity the way sound had been defying silence, the way time had been defying measurement. In each city, the columns formed the same structure, a pillar of water connecting earth to sky, perfectly still at the core, while the outer edges churned with reversed current. And in each column, the same invitation that New Orleans had witnessed. Figures moving inside the water, light cascading like stairs, and a pulling, not physical, but unmistakable, toward a threshold that existed in the space between liquid and air, between now and what came next. This time, the people who walked into the rivers weren't just drawn by music. They walked because they recognized something. The figure in the chair, the voice in the song, the shape in the water. They walked because staying felt more dangerous than going. They walked because the choice had become binary and postponement was no longer available. Families stood on riverbanks, divided. Some saw the columns as judgment and ran. Some saw them as rescue and walked forward. Some saw them as test and froze, unable to decide, caught between two convictions of equal strength. Emergency services didn't respond. First responders stood with everyone else, watching, some with hands on duty belts, some with hands folded in prayer, all equally helpless before a moment too large for protocol. By sunset, an estimated 200,000 people had entered the 17 rivers. The water held them, not drowning, not releasing, holding. And as darkness fell across the nation,
the music shifted one final time. It stopped being invitation. It became announcement. 7 notes, repeated, clear, unmistakable. A trumpet call that didn't ask, it declared. In living rooms where families had gathered around empty dinner tables, unable to eat, unable to speak, the same thought surfaced simultaneously across thousands of minds. This is the 7th day, and on the 7th day, everything that was separated gets called back together. The columns of water stood through the night, glowing faintly from within, visible from space. 17 pillars of light marking 17 cities, like candles on a birthday cake the size of a nation. And in the silence between trumpet calls, those who were watching heard something new, footsteps.
The column collapsed at sunset, slowly, gently, the water returning to horizontal flow. The current resuming its ancient path toward the Gulf, and the people who had walked into the river surfaced, all of them, not gasping, not panicked, not traumatized, changed. They didn't speak about what they'd heard beneath the water. Most couldn't. The language wasn't available. But their eyes carried something new. Not knowledge exactly, but recognition, as though they'd been shown a map and couldn't unsee the destination. The instruments fell silent at midnight. New Orleans woke the next morning to a city that looked identical, but felt fundamentally altered, as though a membrane had been punctured and what had been separate was now touching. Officials called it mass hysteria. Psychologists proposed shared delusion triggered by environmental stress. The mayor issued statements about water quality and sound pollution, promising investigations that would quietly disappear into bureaucratic archives. But the witnesses knew, the 40,000 who walked, the hundreds who entered the water, the millions who heard the music through screens and streams before the footage vanished from every platform simultaneously. Something had used New Orleans as a tuning fork. The sound had gone out, and somewhere in 17 other cities across the nation, musicians were waking to find their instruments warm to the touch, humming faintly, as though charging for a performance not yet announced. The pattern was complete now. Water, fire, earth, wind, insect, metal, memory, and sound. 8 elements, 17 cities, 31 days. And in the silence that followed the music, a new sound began, faint, distant, like brass warming in the sun. Time behaved differently after New Orleans. People checked their phones obsessively, not for messages, but to confirm the date. Clocks ran forward normally, yet the days felt compressed, as though hours were being skipped, moments erased between blinks. Scientists at the Naval Observatory reported microsecond discrepancies in atomic timekeeping, fluctuations too small to matter, too consistent to ignore. Something was counting down, and the intervals were no longer equal. 6 days after the music stopped in New Orleans, reports began surfacing from the other 16 cities, not on news channels. Those had gone strangely quiet about the events, citing ongoing investigations that never produced findings. The reports came through back channels, church prayer chains, amateur radio operators, handwritten letters arriving at newspaper offices with no return address. The music had returned. Not in New Orleans, everywhere else. Seattle, Phoenix, Detroit, all the cities that had experienced phenomena in the previous month were now hearing the same impossible concert. Instruments playing themselves. The same melody New Orleans had heard, but evolved now, more complex, carrying additional phrases, like verses being added to a song already in progress. And this time, it wasn't fading, it was building. By the 6th evening, every affected city reported the same secondary phenomenon: technology degradation. Not failure, degradation. Cell phones worked,
but conversations became difficult. Words arrived seconds after they were spoken, creating overlapping dialogues that made communication nearly impossible. Text messages appeared scrambled, letters rearranging themselves into patterns that looked almost intentional, almost linguistic. Internet connections slowed to pre-dial-up speeds, then stopped entirely in certain zip codes, always the zones closest to water sources, rivers, lakes, coastlines. Power grids remained functional but unstable. Lights dimmed and brightened rhythmically, pulsing in sync with the music only some people could hear.
Not approaching, descending. They called themselves nothing at first. No name, no organization, just people who'd stood at the riverbanks and not walked in. People who'd heard the music and felt nothing. People who'd seen the figure in the chair and found it empty or incomprehensible or terrifying enough to turn away from. By the 8th day, they began finding each other. Not through social media, that was barely functional. Not through official channels, those had gone silent or worse, aggressively normal, broadcasting sports scores and stock prices as though the pillars of water still standing in 17 cities were simply weather phenomena requiring no comment. They found each other the old way, handwritten signs in windows, chalk marks on sidewalks, coded phrases in grocery store conversations. Did you see? Met with, I saw, followed by an address, a time, a basement or backyard or abandoned church. In Minneapolis, a retired librarian named Sarah Chen organized the first gathering, 43 people in a high school gymnasium sitting in a circle because no one wanted to stand at the front and pretend to have answers. I need to know what you saw, she said quietly. Not what you think it meant, what you actually saw. The testimonies lasted 6 hours. Marcus Webb, a transit worker from Philadelphia, spoke first. I was there when the church veil tore. I didn't see a tornado. I saw, I don't know what I saw. Something inside the wind, a shape. It looked at the building like it was reading it, like architecture was language. Then it reached out. I know that sounds crazy, and it pulled that curtain apart, like separating pages in a book. He paused, hands shaking. I ran. Everyone else stood there praying or crying or taking videos, but I ran. And I don't know if that makes me a coward or if I'm the only one who understood what I was seeing. A woman across the circle, Andrea Moss, a pediatric nurse from Denver, nodded slowly. I saw the cloud, the lamb shape everyone's talking about, but I also saw what was behind it. The cloud was a shadow of something higher up, something the snow was falling from. And whatever that was, it wasn't gentle. The lamb was just what we were allowed to see. One by one, they shared. Not the sanitized versions they'd told reporters or family, the real versions, the details that made them sound insane or heretical or both. A trucker who'd driven through the Las Vegas swarm. The flies weren't attacking randomly. They targeted specific buildings, specific people. I watched them avoid a homeless man sleeping on the street and completely cover a man in a $1,000 suit, like they could smell something we can't. An accountant who'd witnessed the DC Raven event. I picked up one of the coins. The skull wasn't stamped. It was moving, slowly, like it was breathing. I dropped it, and when I looked for it again, it had dissolved into the pavement, like the ground drank it. Patterns emerged from the testimonies, disturbing consistencies. Everyone who'd entered the water columns reported feeling called by name, not audibly, but cellularly, as though their bodies recognized a frequency their minds couldn't process. Everyone who'd stayed on shore reported feeling dismissed, not rejected, dismissed, as though they were meant to witness, not participate, as though their role was documentation, not transformation. We're not the saved, Sarah said carefully, but I don't think we're the damned either. I think we're the record keepers. The phrase settled over the group like snow. A theology professor from Boston, Daniel Park, who'd lost his wife to the Mississippi column, spoke next. In Revelation, there are 144,000 who are sealed, marked, protected but not raptured. They survived the tribulation to testify. Every apocalyptic tradition has a version of this, the witnesses who lived through it to tell what happened. You think that's us? Marcus asked. I think we weren't called into the water because we're supposed to see what comes out of it. They began documenting everything systematically. Paper only, electronics were too unstable. Handwritten journals, sketches, maps, timelines cross-referenced between cities. Every group that formed in the 17 cities followed the same instinct. Record this before memory fails, before the official narrative solidifies, before truth becomes impossible to reconstruct. In Portland, a group of engineers built a Faraday cage in a warehouse basement to protect their documentation from electromagnetic interference. They stored eyewitness accounts, photographs developed from actual film, audio recordings on magnetic tape. In Houston, a network of ham radio operators maintained 24-hour contact between cities, sharing updates in code whenever possible. The pillars still stand, new figures visible at depth. The music changed keys last night. Sounds like a different question now. In Phoenix, a former journalist named Rebecca Santos started printing a newsletter. Actual printing press, actual paper, distributed hand to hand. No editorializing, just facts. Who entered the water? Who stayed behind? What changed each day? The first issue's headline, "We are still here. We don't know why."
By the 10th day, a new phenomenon emerged among the watchers. They began recognizing each other before introductions. Not physically, they'd never met, but something deeper, a resonance, a mutual frequency. Sarah described it. You walk into a room full of strangers and immediately know who was at the rivers, not because they look different, because they feel present in a specific way, like they're here completely, not half dissolved into phones or distraction or denial. The groups grew, hundreds in each city, then thousands, not organizing into movements or churches or militias, just gathering, comparing notes, staying alert, and watching the ones who'd entered the water. The columns had become transparent by the 9th day. Anyone could now see the people suspended inside, hundreds of them in each pillar, arranged in spiral patterns, rotating slowly like genetic helixes, like strands being woven together. They weren't drowning, they weren't floating. They stood upright, arms at their sides, eyes open, facing each other in concentric rings, and they were changing. Families on the banks reported it first. A mother in Seattle, "That's my son. I can see his face clearly, but his skin is different. It looks like light is moving underneath it, like he's being rewritten from the inside, not from the people in the water, from the children." Across all 17 cities, children under the age of 7 who had not entered the columns began speaking in languages their parents didn't recognize. Not babbling, structured speech, complete sentences in Aramaic, ancient Hebrew, Koine Greek, languages they'd never been exposed to, delivered with fluency that linguists confirmed was grammatically flawless. Parents brought them to the watcher groups in confusion and terror. A translator in Chicago, a retired seminary professor, listened to a 4-year-old girl speak for 3 minutes in 1st century Aramaic, then went pale. "What did she say?" the mother demanded. He wrote it down in English. "The door is open. The scroll is unsealed. Those who were first will be last to understand. Those who were last have already crossed over. Count the days. When you reach 3, cover your eyes. What comes next is not for human sight until human sight has been remade." The girl stopped speaking, looked at her mother, and asked for juice in perfect English, with no memory of what she'd just said. By nightfall, 47 children across the 17 cities had delivered the same message, word for word, in languages dead for 2,000 years. The watcher groups convened emergency sessions. "From 3 days from what?" someone asked. "From when the children spoke? From when the columns formed?" "From the 7th day," Daniel said quietly. "That's when the pattern started. We're on day 11 now. 3 more brings us to 14. 2 weeks. In biblical numerology, 14 is double completion. 7 times 2. Completion of what? No one answered. Sarah stood at the window of the Minneapolis gymnasium, watching the pillar of light that had replaced the Mississippi's natural flow. "They told us to cover our eyes," she said. "That means something's coming we're not ready to see. Something that will blind us if we look directly at it." Marcus joined her at the window. "Or something so terrible that seeing it unprepared would break our minds. Or so holy," Andrea added from behind them, "that mortal eyes can't hold the image." The 3 possibilities hung in the air: judgment, horror, or glory. The watchers didn't know which, but they knew they had 3 days to prepare for the moment when looking away would no longer be an option. And witnesses don't get to close their eyes, even when every instinct screams to look away. It began at dawn on the 12th day. The music stopped mid-phrase, not fading, severed, as though a conductor had dropped dead, and the orchestra froze with instruments still raised. The pillars of water remained standing, but the movement inside ceased. The figures suspended in the columns stopped rotating. They hung motionless, perfectly still, like specimens in formaldehyde, caught between transformation and completion.
And then, silence. Not the absence of sound, something heavier. A presence that pressed down on the auditory world like a hand covering a mouth. Birds didn't sing, wind didn't stir. Even the residual hum of electrical infrastructure, that constant companion of modern life, went quiet. People emerged from their homes into streets that felt like photographs. Everything visible, nothing audible. Sarah Chen stood in her driveway in Minneapolis and clapped her hands once, sharply. The sound arrived muted, as though traveling through water to reach her ears. She tried again, same result. The air itself had become dampening material, absorbing vibration, refusing to carry it. After weeks of impossible music, supernatural phenomena, and catastrophic disruptions, the quiet arrived like an exhale. People slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Hospitals reported a sudden drop in anxiety admissions. Stock markets inexplicably rallied. News anchors spoke in hushed tones, not because they needed to, but because shouting felt obscene in the new acoustic environment. People returned to work. Schools reopened. Restaurants filled with customers speaking quietly across tables. Everyone pretending the muted world was normal. Everyone carefully not mentioning the 17 pillars of light still standing in 17 cities. The watcher groups recognized the silence for what it was immediately. "This is worse," Daniel said during an emergency gathering in Boston. The group had grown to nearly 300 people, meeting in an old theater with excellent acoustics that no longer mattered. Even in the enclosed space, sound barely traveled. "Why worse?" someone asked. "At least nothing's happening." "That's exactly why it's worse," Rebecca Santos answered from Portland via ham radio, her voice crackling through equipment that barely functioned anymore. "Every apocalyptic tradition has a pause, a moment of false peace right before the final act. It's a test to see who falls back asleep." Marcus Webb nodded. In Matthew 24, Jesus warns about exactly this. As in the days of Noah, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. Life as usual, normalcy as narcotic. Then the flood came and took them all. "The flood is already here," someone pointed out. "People are standing in it." "No," Sarah said quietly. "The flood hasn't started yet. The water's just in gathering." The second day of silence brought cognitive dissonance to lethal levels. 2 realities existed simultaneously, and the human mind kept trying to choose between them. Reality 1, the past month had been a series of explainable events amplified by mass hysteria. The silence proved the crisis had passed. Life could resume. Reality 2,
Hundreds of thousands of people were standing in columns of water that defied physics, their bodies visibly transforming into something non-human, while the entire nation existed under an acoustic dampening field of unknown origin. Most people chose reality one, not consciously, not deliberately. They simply drifted back, turned away from the rivers, stopped checking the news, focused on small, manageable tasks, laundry, grocery shopping, lawn care, anything to avoid looking at the pillars. The watcher groups documented this retreat with mounting horror. They're not in denial, James Tran observed in New Orleans, watching crowds return to the French Quarter, carefully routing their paths to avoid sightlines to the river. They're in selective blindness. Their eyes work fine, but their brains are editing out what they see. A psychologist in the Seattle group, Dr. Linda Morrison, explained it's called cognitive filtering. The mind can only handle so much existential threat before it starts amputating perception to preserve function. They literally can't see the columns anymore. The brain is protecting itself by deleting the unacceptable, but the watchers could still see, and what they saw was getting worse. The figures in the water had stopped looking human. Not monstrous, the transformation wasn't toward horror, but definitively other. Their proportions had shifted beyond the range of human variation, too tall, too symmetrical, too luminous, and their eyes had opened, all of them, simultaneously, at noon on the 13th day.
Not literal footsteps. No one could pinpoint a source, but the sensation of approach, of something massive moving closer, displacing air, creating pressure changes that bodies registered even if ears couldn't capture the sound. The watcher groups felt it most acutely. "Something's descending," Sarah whispered. Though whispering was unnecessary, all speech was whisper level now. "Can you feel it? Like the sky is lowering?" They could all feel it. A weight pressing down from above, getting heavier hour by hour. James checked his barometer obsessively. Atmospheric pressure is increasing, not weather pattern increase. This is different, like the sky is becoming more dense, more present, or like heaven is getting closer to earth, someone said. No one laughed. No one corrected them. As the third day stretched into its impossible 27th hour, people made their final choices. Some boarded windows and retreated into basements, as though shelter from weather could protect against what was coming. Some drove away from the 17 cities, highways clogged with evacuees who had no destination, only momentum away from the pillars. Some walked to the riverbanks and stood waiting, though the invitation to enter had ceased. They simply wanted to be close to the transformed when whatever was coming arrived. And the watchers gathered in their groups, documentation complete, nothing left to record, waiting for the instruction the children had delivered. When you reach 3, cover your eyes. But how do you cover your eyes against something you can feel approaching through your skin? At hour 27, minute 13, the children spoke again, all of them, simultaneously, in every city, every language, every home where a child under 7 existed. When sight returned, the pillars were empty, not collapsed, not dissipated, empty. The water columns still stood, 17 towers of liquid crystal stretching from earth to cloud, but the hundreds of thousands who'd been suspended inside were gone. Gone where became apparent within seconds. They were standing on the riverbanks, all of them, arranged in perfect concentric circles around each pillar, facing outward toward the cities, toward the crowds who'd waited and watched and wept. But they were not what they had been. The transformation was complete. Their bodies held human shape the way a glass holds water, the container recognizable, the contents fundamentally changed. Skin that reflected light like polished stone, eyes that contained depths no human iris could achieve, proportions adjusted toward mathematical perfection, every feature refined to ideal symmetry. They looked like humanity's final draft,
what the species might become after 1,000,000 years of evolution, or what it was always meant to be before something went wrong at the beginning. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence spoke. Sarah Chen stood 50 feet from the Minneapolis Circle, close enough to see her neighbor among the transformed. Lisa Martinez, a woman she'd carpooled with for 3 years, who'd entered the water on the 7th day holding her daughter's hand. "Lisa?" Sarah whispered, though the silence had ended and normal volume had returned. Lisa's mouth didn't move, but Sarah heard the response inside her skull, clear as thought but undeniably external. I was Lisa. That name described a temporary condition. What I am now has no name you could pronounce, but I remember her. I remember you, and I am sorry for what comes next. Sarah stumbled backward. What comes next? The transformed, all of them, in all 17 cities, raised their right hands simultaneously and pointed. In New York, the stock exchange trading floor vanished while the historic facade stood intact. The mechanism of commerce erased, the beautiful shell preserved. Screaming filled the streets, not from casualties. The transformed had somehow evacuated every building seconds before erasure. People stumbled out of doorways moments before the structures behind them ceased to exist. No one died, but everyone understood. This was not destruction. This was editing, reality being revised. Everything built on corrupted foundation was being selectively deleted, while humanity itself remained untouched. A message written in absence. You can rebuild, but not this. Never this again.
When it stopped, every city had been fundamentally altered, not destroyed, refined. The cathedrals remained, the hospitals remained. Libraries, schools, homeless shelters, parks, anything built for genuine service stood untouched, but temples to greed, vanity, and power had been excised with brutal efficiency. The skylines looked wounded, gap-toothed, incomplete, or perhaps, for the first time, honest. The transformed lowered their hands. Then, as one, they turned and walked back into the pillars, not reluctantly, not dramatically, simply as though completing a shift, clocking out, returning to wherever they'd been stationed before this moment required their presence. The water accepted them. They rose through the columns, ascending toward the cloud layer, bodies dissolving into light as they climbed. Within 3 minutes, all of them had disappeared upward, pulled into sky, into whatever existed beyond the visible atmosphere. The pillars remained, but emptied again, waiting, ready. And everyone understood. The door was still open. The invitation had not been rescinded. It had simply paused, allowing those who'd witnessed to reconsider their choice. In the aftermath, the world fractured along a line that had always existed, but was now impossible to ignore. Some called it judgment and wept. Some called it mercy and gave thanks. Some called it alien intervention or mass weapon deployment or coordinated psychological operation. But the watchers, the ones who'd stood at the rivers and not entered, who documented everything, who'd kept their eyes open when instructed to cover them, they understood something the others didn't. This wasn't the end. This was the choice. Daniel Park stood in Boston looking at the altered skyline, half the city's recognizable landmarks simply gone, and felt a certainty he'd never experienced in 20 years of theological study. "The scroll is open," he said quietly to the group gathered around him. That's what the voice said. In Revelation, when the scroll is opened, what happens? "The seals break," Rebecca answered via radio from Portland. "One by one, 7 seals, 7 judgments." "No," Sarah corrected from Minneapolis, 7 revelations. The Greek word can mean both. Judgment and revelation are the same thing, truth being made visible. "How many events have we witnessed?" Andrea asked from Denver. They counted together. Philadelphia, Miami, New Orleans, Las Vegas, the Salt Lake, the Mississippi, the Ravens, the floods, Hollywood, Yellowstone. More than 7, but the events clustered into 7 categories, 7 types of phenomena, 7 revelations of what had been hidden: water, fire, earth, air, corruption, memory, sound.
7 seals opened in sequence. If that was just the seals breaking, Marcus said slowly, then what happens when the trumpets sound? Silence. Not the supernatural silence of the previous 3 days. Human silence. The quiet of people realizing they've only witnessed the beginning. The children spoke again that evening. Same message in every home. The door remains open until the 7th trumpet. After that, what is inside stays inside. What is outside stays outside. Choose now or choose never. But know this, the 8th day is not coming. This is the last week of the old world. The new world begins when 7 becomes 8, and 8 has already been spoken into existence. It is only waiting for the last trumpet to make it visible. Parents scrambled to understand. Theologians debated, but the watchers knew. 7 days of creation, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and then the 8th day, the day beyond the week, the day that exists outside time's normal progression, the eternal day, the day that doesn't end. They had until the 7th trumpet to decide which side of the door they wanted to be on when that day began. That night, people made their choices. Some walked to the rivers. The pillars accepted them, water closing over their heads, beginning the transformation that would take 3 days to complete, the same duration Christ spent in the tomb, the same span between death and resurrection. Some ran, grabbed keys, packed cars, drove toward borders that no longer offered escape because the phenomenon was global, but movement felt like action, and action felt like control, even when both were illusions. Some simply waited, in homes, in churches, in the watcher groups that had become humanity's archive, its memory, its witness to what came before the world changed. And some, a remnant within the remnant, began preparing for a task they didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. If they were meant to watch, to document, to survive, then they were also meant to remember, to carry the story forward, to be the bridge between what was and what would be. They gathered the documentation, protected it, hid copies in places that might survive whatever was coming. Not to preserve the old world, that was already being dismantled piece by piece, revelation by revelation, but to explain to whoever existed on the 8th day, this is what the 7th day looked like. This is what it cost. This is what we chose and why, and what we became because of it. Sarah stood at her window on the 14th night, watching the pillar of light that had replaced the Mississippi's natural flow. She had not entered the water. She had been given that choice every day for a week and had not taken it. Not from fear, not from disbelief, from understanding that her role was different, harder perhaps, less glorious certainly, to stay, to witness, to remember when memory becomes the only weapon against the erasure of truth. Her phone buzzed, a miracle of technology briefly functioning. A text from Rebecca in Portland. 6th trumpet sounded somewhere. Reports from Jerusalem. Something's waking up that was bound. We're running out of time. Sarah looked at the pillar, at the empty streets, at the sky that seemed closer now, more present, pressing down with intention, and she understood. The final threshold wasn't a place, it was a moment. The moment when running no longer matters, when preparation becomes irrelevant, when the only choice left is who you'll be when everything you knew dissolves and something unimaginable takes its place. She picked up her pen, old technology, reliable, analog, and wrote in the journal that would outlast her. Day 14. The pillars still stand. The transformed have shown us what we could become. The erasure has shown us what we must abandon.
The door remains open, but I hear footsteps on the other side, not approaching, arriving. If you find this after the seventh trumpet, know that we saw it coming, we documented it, we chose our positions, and we waited, not for rescue, but for revelation. For the moment when the veil tears completely, and we finally see what was always standing on the other side, waiting to cross over. She set down the pen. Outside, the pillar pulsed once, twice, and somewhere in the distance, carried on wind that shouldn't exist in the stillness, the first notes of a trumpet began to form. Not the seventh, but close, so close.